Well, hello with Gratitude Matt listeners. My name is Bill Moran, and I'm Matt's older brother. And today I will be your host for our show with Gratitude Matt. With Gratitude Matt is a place people can come to find the courage to be grateful, regardless of how powerful the storm is. Matt started the blog with gratitudematt.com to track his cancer journey. Our goal with Gratitude Matt is to reach and inspire more people and help them use gratitude on a regular basis. As many of you know, Matt passed away on August 20th. Matt's wife, Mary, and the entire family want to continue to help people through this podcast to find the courage to be grateful. Please know that Matt and the entire family appreciated all your love, prayers, support, and generosity during his journey. His wife, Mary, and our entire family are so grateful and blessed to have your continued support. I am humbled and honored to be here today. Today, I'm super excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Chris Kerr. Dr. Kerr has earned both an MD and a PhD in neurobiology. He is the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Medical Officer for Hospice and Palliative Care in Buffalo, New York. Dr. Kerr realized that many of his patients in hospice had extraordinary experiences as death approached. As a result, he designed studies that would tabulate these experiences in a meaningful way. These experiences are enormous gifts to the dying and those of us left behind. They impact the bereaved because how people leave us matters. How we grieve is impacted by how we experienced their deaths. Dr. Kerr has shared his findings and the importance of these end-of-life experiences to the world, most notably in an award-winning TED Talk titled I See Dead People, Dreams and Visions of the Dying. He authored a book titled Death is But a Dream, Finding Hope and Meaning at Life's End, and released a movie of the same name. In addition, Dr. Kerr continues his work, his research, and is helping his patients and their families realize a more meaningful and purposeful end-of-life experience. I first became aware of Dr. Kerr through Matt, his wife Mary, and Mary's brother, Dr. Ed Cosgrove. Matt spent his final days under the careful and loving care of Dr. Kerr in Hospice of Buffalo. When I asked Dr. Kerr if he would be a guest on With Gratitude Matt, he jumped at the opportunity. Welcome, Dr. Kerr, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind introduction.
Okay. Well, I could have gone on and on, but we wanted to get to the importance of your research and your findings, and I'm just so grateful to have you here today. So, Dr. Kerr, I'm going to kind of lead in. We'll start at the beginning. So, you devoted your career, your energy, and your research to end-of-life experiences. I know it's a long answer, but how did that come about?
Unintentionally and by accident. I had no interest in this area of medicine at all. I actually was a cardiology fellow, and I worked in the ER with Ed Cosgrove for many years. And I was just moonlighting and came to hospice completely uneducated and uninformed on what it meant to be caring for people at the end of their life, because in training we typically signed off on these people because there was nothing more to do to them. And I was just struck immediately that there was so much I didn't understand. There's the dying we obviously observe, physical decline and lessening, but that there was a subjective side, there was the experiential side that the patient was experiencing. And it was really paradoxical to the physical side that they were actually very rich, vibrant, and very much alive in there. And the work grew out of a frustration in trying to teach it to medical students because we live in an evidence-based time that there's nothing on this kind of thing. And of course, the irony is it's always been written about throughout time and across cultures, but it wasn't in medical language, our language. So that's why we did the studies.
So kind of to give our listeners a little bit of a glimpse to you're a medical doctor, you have a PhD in neurobiology, But then you, through your writings and your research, you came to the conclusion that dying is more of a human experience than a medical experience. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah. So what's happened over time is medicine gets more advanced. We become ever more enamored by the science of medicine, but not its art. And dying is really something that we're sort of death denying and death defying. And somehow dying, which really is a closing of a life and inevitable, has become this medical problem to solve. And that's why the majority of Americans don't want to die in the hospital, but end up dying in the hospital because that's where they're recognized. There's this sense that we can always, like, we're consumers of healthcare, and there's always something we can do to prevent dying, and we treat it as organ failure, like failing parts, not, again, a holistic view of it, which is the closing of a life.
So you in your writings and your research, you use the phrase end of life experiences, and kind of for the listeners, what does all that entail, and what at hospice do you offer to help that journey?
Yeah, so end of life experiences, it's really tricky nomenclature. We use that to describe the subjective inner processes of dying. The other words used, the closest language we have is kind of dreams or visions or that sort of thing. The reason why it's sticky for us is that if you talk to people about them, they're adamant this isn't a dream, right? They say I don't remember my dreams, or this was very different. These tend not to be fantastical or metaphorical or require analysis. They're based on real life events. And when we measure realism on a 1 to 10 scale, they tend to be a 10. So they feel lived experience, but that's the term we use as end of life experiences.
And you kind of touched on this in a comment earlier, but in the Western medical world, we don't really maybe talk about this as much. We talk more about the weather than maybe we do about end of life experiences. And maybe you can kind of explain a little bit of the why behind that.
Yeah, I think it's it's become easier to live longer, but harder to die well. And we view it through this medical paradigm. And when you do that, you focus on body parts. That wasn't true even a generation ago. We grew up and we would say, how did grandma die? She died of old age.
Right.
But you were allowed to die of old age. Now you're going to have 10 diagnoses and more likely die in the hospital. So it's sad because dying is a reflective experience. It's a different vantage point. You naturally look back on life. You stop caring about your taxes or whether your oil change, and you start to focus on the things that matter. So it's not surprising then that there are these inner experiences that are very, very, very different, and that's what the patient doesn't experience liver failure. They don't experience kidney failure. They experience life at its end, and there's a richness inside to that. We did this really interesting study where we looked at dying as a traumatic experience, and this idea of post-traumatic growth. Like the idea you could go to war, and yes, it's a negative experience, but there are positive attributes like friendships, for example. And when we did that in dying, what we found was fascinating. It's actually measurable. Yes, they're physically declining, but paradoxically, they're emotionally, psychologically, spiritually very much alive. And people don't stop learning and adapting right until the very last days of life. So the take home basically is the dying patient doesn't stop living because they're dying. And there's actually a profound amount of living to do that's deeply meaningful. If you think of your own situation, what it did to strengthen and draw the inner dynamics of your relationships, right, closer and more meaningful, in very profound and important ways. That's just part of this. And if we had one aim in this whole effort, it is to demedicalize the process and reclaim it as a humanizing process and one in which the patient should always have a say.
That's a gift that you give the patient, and that care that you're giving is well, it's beautiful. It's so powerful. I'm going to shift a little bit over, and we're going to get, this is the 73rd podcast. Matt did 71 of these. And I'm kind of taking it over and carrying the torch here for the family. But one of the things that Matt did in a lot of his episodes was he got real, he got vulnerable, and he was able to kind of shed a little bit of light of his journey and how that might help others. But the one thing that and maybe you can help because you cared for and your team cared for Matt on his final days, but Matt owned his journey. He owned his health. He owned his diagnosis. And why is that important for both the patient and the family when they're going through these end-of-life experiences?
Oh, I think it's wonderful. I think advanced illness in itself, and I can speak from experience, dying in particular, there is a loss, there's a surrendering, a loss of ultimate control over the thing that matters most, which is the trajectory of your existence, right? And there's a risk in that one, you can be victimized to your circumstance. You can be totally defined, and we see this, by illness. So I'm no longer a human, right? I'm not seen in the totality and dimensionality of my existence. I'm seen as a medical problem. So anytime anyone takes the stage in their own story and give voice to something larger, and I think what's unbelievable is how often people change perspective. They don't lose hope. Hope changes. So hope changes from cure to hope for others. And it's a wonderful aspect in the human story that actually people do come to some understanding of where they are generally. But what they don't stop caring, they still care. It's just for other people. How are they going to be and how are they doing? And so there's this idea that they want to give and give and give of themselves. So this podcast series, for example, is an example of that. You got somebody struggling to get through a day, experiencing physical symptoms that you and I can't really relate to or say we even come close to understanding. Yet what matters most, perhaps, is that he was giving of himself to others. And that's the most redeeming quality in our struggle to remain humane, is that we continue to bring meaning and love and value for other people, and that sickness doesn't limit that, but actually can enhance it, is powerful, and returns their controls to you. So it makes sense to me.
Well, that's beautiful, and I'm so happy that Matt was in your care and in your team's care. It was incredible, and I do have to confess. So, when Matt he called me, and he said he was going to hospice, and we exchanged. We told each other we loved each other, and I really struggled with his mortality. I mean, up till that point, we knew the diagnosis was tough, but we also knew who Matt was. And I looked at, he's my younger brother. He's athletic. He's handsome. He's a devoted father. He's a loving husband. He's a faithful Catholic, and he's going to be called to heaven. And I was conflicted, honestly, on whether to drive from Cincinnati to Buffalo to be with him. I'd just been up there 2 weeks earlier, and I tried to keep myself busy, but I knew I needed to be with Matt. I was there when Mom and Dad brought him home from the hospital, and I knew I had to be at his bedside when I was going to walk him to heaven. And fortunately, my family told me that I needed to get up there, and to use Matt's word, I'm grateful I did. When I arrived at Matt's bedside, I gave him a kiss. I gave him a hug. I told him I loved him. And then I gave him a few more kisses, and I gave him a few more hugs. And I said those were from each of his family members. And Matt responded with a beautiful smile. And it's hard to describe how beautiful that smile was. But to use your words, that was a gift. And that's a gift that I get to carry and I get to share, and I'm sharing it here today. And I know others have lost loved ones, and they've experienced very similar experiences like this. But how important is that experience at the bedside with a loved one who is, at their end of life? Doctor, how?
I think, well, you said this at the beginning, how people leave us matters, right? And it can be defined as empty, without any redeeming qualities, dehumanizing, void of any spirituality, of love, or it can be this remarkable, incomparable experience where you feel something better. And that's what you made sure you shared with him. It's interesting when you described the story, you didn't focus on the physicality of his appearance. You didn't focus on the sadness of seeing him transformed physically, what he may have been suffering with, whether it was cough, trying to breathe. You focused about what was inside. It's interesting that this is largely focused on gratitude. We did this large-scale study that we haven't published, but we're just finishing to write up, because caregiving is so often described in negative terms. If you looked at the books on caregiving and you found out you were going to be one, you'd go to a bridge and jump. It's all measured in terms of, the vernacular of our time, your life balance and all that other bullshit. It's just, and the funniest thing is, though, if you actually talk to caregivers, what they will tell you essentially is that was the best, hardest thing I've ever done. And so we did this study, and there's measures of gratitude, and what we found was enormous gratefulness. The weird part was, the harder the lifting during the caregiving, the more gratitude. So it's inversely proportional to struggle.
So this was in the care team and the family members?
The caregivers of the patient. The important thing is caregiving is such a larger experience that's felt not at a transactional level of cleaning, feeding, but it's felt at a deep spiritual and psychological level.
Well, it's almost like it's a vocation, really, in addition.
You said something, you touched on it in an odd way. So what caregiving does is you touched on it a couple ways. It stops you from running on the rat wheel of your life, okay? You're an attorney, you've got obligations, and you said it. And, I stopped, and I went to Buffalo, right? So you stop your life, and then the next thing you said is you brought reverence and remembrance to your family members that you remember who at some level you're connected, that's defining, and you shared their gestures of love and a kiss and a hug to him. So what caregiving does is it's not elective. It forces you to pause and find meaning and worth and redemption and love in what truly matters for being here. And it has to come to surface and be expressed. And you did those things. So you're busy going along the day, boom, you hit the brakes, you turn your car, come up here, and you went from being busy in life to focusing on what matters from your life. And, I thought it was beautiful. You described him from seeing him come home from the hospital to see him at the end. So you see it in its panoramic form, and it's even richer. That's gratitude.
Well, thank you. And I was just the vessel. I was the lucky one to be there. And the family was too. Mary and my sisters and everyone was. So it was, like, to use your words, it was life affirming, not life denying. So it was a beautiful. You said it more eloquently when you talked about your caregivers, but I described it as beautiful and sad at all the same time. So
Yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed in your book, and especially in the powerful, and I encourage, and in the show notes, we're going to provide links so that the listeners can really dive into your book, your TED Talk, and really, I think the interviews that you had with the patients were so powerful. One of the things that Matt always tried to remind his listeners was to be present. And I noticed that message in your research and in your studies. How is that important, and what have you observed in that with being present?
It's hard work getting to the point where you can work through the grief, whether experiencing or anticipated, the sense of loss, the injustices, saying goodbye. The only way that happens is if you're open to seeing something that has more value, and as you said, affirms rather than denies life. And that only happens by being present. I think it's so easy to distract ourselves. I do it every day with the truly irrelevant and be unpresent and unmindful. But I think, it really, that's what brought me here, was that when I was removed from the hospital and the allure of all the technology and the acts of doing and a full team, and you're just compelled, it's just you, patient, and you're at the bedside, and you got no tricks, and you can't role play. So you're forced to being present. And all you have is presence. And sometimes that doesn't even require language. It's just being present. It's learning how to be a comforter. And that what you have to give is just what you got. And your shared past, like you did with your brother. So it's all that. Yeah.
So that's beautiful and so powerful, and I hope the listeners get the impact of that, because that is amazing. The findings that you made, and you have, you've lived it. You were real. You did it. You were present for those patients, and one of the things that we've talked about this end of life experience and the effect on the dying, and then also on the family members. But how does that carry over to the grieving process, and what, kind of getting back again, we've mentioned it twice already, how you leave us matters. And how can that help what you're doing? And what you've observed, how can that help those that are grieving?
Oh, it helps immensely, and we've published studies on this with about 750 bereaved family or loved ones. And as you said, how people leave matters, and you can view death in terms of its finality and the end point, or you can see in it the opportunity to connect to something larger. So the clearest example that we've seen many times, and you've got a couple who may have lost a child at or shortly after birth, and they've been together for 60 plus years. And at the end of the life, the one person is actually feels the presence or talking to this lost child. And that's the best example of inverting dying to empty and without redeeming qualities to something that actually, again, validates having lived and mattered. And what it also does is it connects the person at the bedside to the experience, so that what you end up feeling is that there's this connectivity across lives, whether they're living or not. And so it gives a version of a better story. And when we looked at bereavement, and there's tools to measure bereavement, how do you remember? How do you get through? How do you still have a relationship? How do you cope? People who experience these things absolutely changes how you process loss. And also how you have reverence. The videos of the family, I think, are as compelling as they are the patient. I don't know if you saw the one, I'm bringing this up because I was just looking at it with somebody, a lady named Sue, whose mom was very demented. But as she's getting closer to death, she's waking up and she's sharing these wonderful stories, because every time she's closed her eyes, she's with her deceased husband. And so she's actually living a better, richer, happier existence, kind of present and connected in love. And at the end of her life, she tries to escape the facility. And what she's doing is she's reliving her wedding day. So she's got to get to Niagara Falls. So when you'd expect escalating psychogenic distress as one's life's closing, she's actually reclaiming lost love. And it's just amazing. So when you hear the daughter talk, and she talked about, because you asked this question about the caregiver and the bereaved, she actually talked about how nice it was to go visit her mom towards the end of her life, because spiritually and psychologically, she was just in this wonderful place, and she had these great stories to share about her husband. So,
well, that certainly will help us all as we experience this in our own lives. So, I don't want to take too much more of your time, and because I know you've got some great work that you're working on. But if you could kind of share to the listeners some of the exciting ventures that you're working on, and kind of where they can learn more about what you're doing, and just kind of give us a glimpse into the exciting news that you might have coming down the...
I think the most important thing for your listeners is to look at I can't remember the exact linkage, but if you look at Hospice Buffalo End of Life Dreams or Visions, or Hospice Buffalo Patients on YouTube, there's a bundle of videos, because I can't do this justice. You really have to hear from the patients and families themselves, because they're really quite moving. Yeah, we're doing a lot of interesting things. We're working with an Emmy and Academy Award winner on a film that they were working with Indigenous people in Brazil and Australia, and who have had all these cultural beliefs all along, and they're coupling that with our research. And kind of the take home is this has always been part of the human experience. It's not something newly discovered but lost. And that's really cool that we're working on. And then we have just a number of really interesting studies that we're doing as well.
Well, we'll encourage the listeners, and like I said earlier in our show notes, to refer to that, and we'll be sure that they get that information. And again, words don't do it justice. The power of those video interviews with the family and with the patients, it's very impactful. So Dr. Kerr, I'm so grateful that we met through Matt, Mary, and the Cosgrove family. I want to thank you for your team's care of Matt and of his family. That's most appreciated. I want to thank you for bringing peace, compassion, and grace and love to all those that you care for in their final chapter of their earthly life. Is there anything that you would like to add as kind of a closing remark here? Because,
Well, I just think it's fun talking to you not only because you've obviously given this a great depth of thought, but I think it's part of this story of gratitude and reverence for your brother that is that helps give death and loss a very different experience, a meaning. So congratulations. It's a heavy obligation, and but you're doing it well. So congratulations to you.
It's my privilege to do it, and again, I'm just the voice behind it. I have the whole entire Cosgrove and Moran families behind me, encouraging and supporting us. But so one of the things that Matt would always close with and kind of remind his listeners of, he met roadblocks, and his dedication, work ethic and willingness to help others on his journey was his gift to us, and we want to continue that. Doctor, I see that I see that in your life and in your work, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
And thank you for all those you've cared for. We're so inspired by what you've said here today and the work that you've done. I'll remind our listeners to put into practice Dr. Kerr's message, and learn how they can apply some of his lessons to their daily lives. Matt reminded us there are 3 things that we can do. Find the courage to be grateful, regardless of how powerful the storm is. Be present with those that we are around. Pay attention to what we are feeding our mind, our body, and our soul. Again, a tremendous thank you to our today's guest, Dr. Chris Kerr. Remember to subscribe to this show, share it with friends, and comment on the show. With Gratitude Matt listeners, until next time, find the courage to be grateful. Godspeed, my friends.